Star Trek, a vision of fully automated luxury communism in space. For others, it's the same mythic vision, but of Western liberalism reaching its full Fukuyama end-of-history potential. There are many socialists that see it as the kind of society that their policies will create. I've even known self-identified fascists that see Star Trek in that same way. Star Trek serves as an aspirational vision for people with widely varied, often opposed philosophies. It's part of why it's such a great cultural mythos. At its best, Trek addresses politics while simultaneously transcending politics. It's also a great vector for analyzing some of those ideas in a philosophical and historical context. Let's begin with the communism angle. There's a lot to unpack here and lots of room down there for angry comments, so set course for heated debate and engage. Rather than start with the old "we don't use money" clip reel that we've all probably seen many times already, I'm just going to jump to the conclusion. The big economic problems have been solved. Cool. It's post-capitalist. The method of production has transitioned from wage laborers in factories and farms to magic boxes that manifest what you want on command. But what do we mean by capitalism? Because in common usage, the term gets so distorted as to be useless. On the one hand, you have those who have read enough communist writings to see capitalism as an exploitive system of wealth extraction and class dominance, but not enough to understand it as a step in an essentially progressive determinist historical model, a stage in a society's development. In which case, raging against capitalism is sort of like trying to tear down childhood. There's also that libertarian position that capitalism is just private property and free markets, the default state of social interaction.
Pure fiction.
Capitalism is a specific relationship of wealth, labor, and ownership arising largely from the technological conditions of society over the last few hundred years. So, an illustrative example. Say I start a business selling shoes. I buy a bunch of sewing machines, leather cutting presses, molding machines to make soles, and then I hire 100 people to do each step in an assembly line fashion. I pay them as little as the prevailing labor market will allow for the quality of workers I need and pocket the profits. In that scenario, I'm a capitalist. The workers make a living and I get rich. But if those machines don't exist, if the concept of them hasn't even been invented, I can't do that. I can hire 100 cobblers, each making shoes at his workstation, but in that scenario, I'm not a capitalist. I don't own the means of production, the cobblers do. Their skills and tools are the productive capital, and they'll only make shoes for my brand if I pay them at least as much as they could sell that same pair for to someone else. If they go on strike, I can't just hire 100 other workers to take over. I need skilled artisans. I don't have a factory, just a building where those artisans worked in close proximity. The means of production walked out the door. And just as industrial looms, metal presses, steam engines, and every other aspect of industrial production made capitalism possible, what Star Trek does, specifically in the Next Generation Deep Space Nine Voyager era, is fundamentally change how goods are produced and distributed.
Industrial replicators.
How people and property interact. The social property relations, as it's often termed. From that, the entire social and economic order naturally changes. You can't have capitalism when mines, factories, and banking have been replaced by replicators and abundant energy. The foundation of how things are made is fundamentally altered, and with it the relationship of people to property and in many ways to each other. Star Trek depicts a post-capitalist society. This doesn't automatically make it communist, however. There are other potential forms of post-capitalist organization. That said, you could describe Star Trek as communist in the sense that energy seems to be abundant enough that basics like food, clothing, housing, and such are effectively free for members of that society. Collective ownership, in a sense. Now here's where it gets really contentious. Star Trek is absolutely not socialist. And I'm not just speaking in the sense of socialism being a transitional phase to true communism. I mean that socialism, in that Marxist transitional stage sense, is as nonsensical and reliant on a suspension of disbelief as Trek lore.
We are Marxists. We understand, as the anarchists and liberals cannot, the nature of power.
So let's use the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics as our example, though this carries through to all socialist systems. Again, I mean socialist as in radical and on our way to communism, not just social democrats with a welfare state and public health coverage. Two very different things. So you start with a capitalist mode of production. You organize the proletariat into a revolutionary force led by a vanguard party directing the transformation from a capitalist to a socialist economic model. You seize the means of production in the name of the workers. The capitalists are out, workers' councils and collectives are in, a new day dawns. Only you have the same methods of production. Factories that need to be staffed by workers. Those workers don't own the means of production in any meaningful sense. They can't. It's a bunch of heavy machinery bolted to the concrete floor. The state owns the means of production in the name of the workers. In the best cases, they do try. Some workers are selected to serve the people as managers, from individual factories all the way up to the national government. A workers' state. In theory. In practice, though, they aren't workers anymore. They've become state managers, bureaucrats, a governing class with their own class interests not entirely aligned with the workers. And the workers still go to the factory, do their repetitive tasks, get paid a wage, and repeat as required. Yes, there is a social services floor to keep them from starving on the street, but they're still essentially market-dependent laborers. This arrangement also tends to disincentivize innovation to some extent. Modern capitalism takes the new and better too far with programmed obsolescence and the throwaway approach to almost everything. But socialism, outside of wartime pressures, tends to go too far the other way for inherent structural reasons. Even fairly minor changes can be disruptive, and centrally planned systems don't like disruptive. In terms of actual operation, it takes capitalism and, through heavy state control, puts a floor on how poor you can get and a ceiling on how rich you can get, but it's still, at the core, that same capitalist mode of industrial production, only instead of the profits going to a relatively small group of capital owners for their private use, they go to a relatively larger group of state managers for public, which is to say state priority use. It's functionally the same thing as having a single megacorporation owning everything. Incidentally, this is the big point of contention with the never-ending fascists were or weren't socialists argument. In theory, no. Socialists are all about the workers, about devolving control and spreading the wealth, while fascists celebrate the concentration of state power as a key point of their ideology. But in practice, both exert powerful state control over essentially capitalist modes of production. Top-down systems of control. They look very similar in practice. And it's in the practical realm where ideas really get tested and should be judged, regardless of how Gramsci or Trotsky spin it. Karl Marx doesn't tell us how to actually build a communist society any more than Miguel Alcubierre shows us how to build a warp drive. Both give us useful theories, useful ideas, but they aren't practical designs. And yet, Star Trek stands above practically every serious communist or socialist party platform or treatise because it recognizes the need to fundamentally alter the methods of producing goods as a prerequisite for moving out of the capitalist system derived from those methods of production. On a basic level, Trek carries an understanding of what needs to happen to get there without pretending to have an actionable plan for how to get there. Trek only pretends to be scientific with its technobabble. Its hazy middle step of we go to the stars, we meet aliens, and we end up being better people with magic boxes that make steak from the air is more honest than actual Communist Party platforms that require consolidating power on the promise that it'll just work so well that it becomes redundant and withers away. What Star Trek does is ask us, is a different form of social and economic system possible? Is a better one possible? And it answers with a tentative yes. And yet, because it's about telling stories set in that world rather than explaining how to get to that world, it doesn't get mired in its own failings. The lore can adapt. Story threads with world-breaking implications can be quietly forgotten. Genesis, for example.
Genesis allowed is not. Is planet forbidden.
But the goal of a better world is always there, as a framework to try new ideas, new stories, and see how they play out. And it's precisely this looking at goals instead of process that makes Star Trek something that socialists and conservatives, communists and laissez-faire liberals can all relate to and aspire to. And that leads to the big question that needs to be asked more often in our own political struggles, both of our opponents and ourselves. Do you want to build a better world for everyone, or do you just want the power to force people to do things your way? A whole lot of people won't face an honest answer to that question. This seems like a good spot to just drop another reminder that YouTube has been doing its quietly unsubscribing thing, so maybe check that tab.